What would you do if your child came home in tears, her head forcibly shaved at school, her medical condition mocked, and her voice ignored? This isn't fiction. It happened to 13-year-old Kamira Hayes, a quiet black girl with alopecia, silenced by a teacher's prejudice and a system's failure. But Kamira didn't stay silent. What started as one act of cruelty sparked a national movement, rewrote school policy, and showed the world what justice looks like when drawn in bold, unflinching lines. The electric hum of clippers filled the school nurse's office, a sound more suited to a barber shop than a place meant to nurture young minds. 13-year-old Kamira Hayes sat frozen as her carefully braided extensions fell in slow motion to the linoleum floor, revealing the patchy scalp she had long hidden due to alopecia. This wasn't a hair violation. This was a cultural erasure disguised as discipline. Ms. Helen Carver, a 7th-grade teacher with 2 decades of classroom experience, stood over Kamira, face taut with self-righteous control. The new dress code had given her just enough cover to enforce an old prejudice. Neat and conservative, vague terms weaponized to police students who didn't fit a narrow mold. Kamira's braids weren't a distraction. They were armor, functional, traditional, and medically necessary. But to Carver, they were defiance. The school didn't call Kamira's parents. No counselor was summoned. Her medical exemption, on file and previously approved, was dismissed as a clerical oversight. Instead, a nurse reluctantly powered on the clippers at Carver's insistence. Kamira's voice broke, trying to explain. Her reasons didn't matter. What happened next wasn't just an isolated overreach. It was the inevitable result of unchecked authority, vague policy, and cultural blindness. And when video footage surfaced online, captured secretly by a classmate, it didn't just show a child losing her hair. It exposed the machinery of a system that too often fails children like Kamira. This wasn't about appearance. It was about power, control, and the quiet violence of institutional neglect. And in that single moment, a silent war began. By the time Kamira's father, James Hayes, arrived at Winston Elementary, the damage had already been done. His daughter, once expressive, bright-eyed, and obsessed with her sketchbook, sat in the nurse's office like a stranger. Her shoulders were hunched, hands tucked inside the sleeves of a hoodie far too large for her frame. Her eyes were vacant. Her head, once adorned with intricate protective braids, was nearly bare. The silence between them was louder than the clippers that had torn away her confidence. Kamira didn't speak on the drive home. She didn't ask questions. She didn't cry. The only sound came from the quiet creak of the seatbelt as she curled against the door, staring out at the fading afternoon light. For James, a logistics coordinator and full-time single parent, while his wife Lena served abroad with the Air National Guard, the silence was unbearable. But he knew trauma when he saw it. And this was more than humiliation. It was the erasure of dignity. That evening, Kamira locked herself in her bedroom. She didn't come down for dinner. She didn't respond when James knocked gently on her door. Instead, she curled into a ball under her covers and stared at the wall, her thoughts spinning in slow, aching circles. For a child with alopecia, a condition that had already tested her confidence, being forcibly exposed in front of classmates felt like a betrayal that words couldn't capture. Her hair wasn't fashion, it was protection, it was privacy, and now it was gone. The school, meanwhile, scrambled to contain the narrative. Principal Cheryl Whitman released a 3-sentence email to parents, citing a disciplinary misunderstanding involving dress code enforcement. No mention of a medical condition, no acknowledgement of a child's trauma. The message had all the warmth of a corporate recall notice. Behind closed doors, district administrators held emergency meetings. They weren't focused on accountability. They were focused on optics, legal exposure, media damage control. The teacher, Ms. Carver, received a one-day suspension, quietly processed and not disclosed publicly. Internally, her file simply read, "Protocol review required." The district attorney advised against admitting wrongdoing, citing privacy law restrictions, but the damage couldn't be confined to boardrooms. The video, a 29-second clip showing Kamira being led down the hallway, her face streaked with tears, Ms. Carver gripping her wrist, had already hit social media. By morning, the #, braids not violations, was trending in multiple cities. The video drew over 500,000 views within 24 hours. Comments poured in, parents sharing similar stories, activists demanding action, and students posting their own experiences with racially coded discipline. Cultural fault lines cracked wide open. The school's vague appearance policies were thrust into public scrutiny. Civil rights advocates highlighted how language like neat and conservative disproportionately targeted black students. National statistics backed this up. Black girls were 5 times more likely to be disciplined for dress code violations than their white peers. States that had failed to pass hair protection laws, like the Crown Act, came under renewed pressure. While the administrators dodged press inquiries, teachers within the school were split. Some, like Mr. Livingston, Kamira's art teacher, were outraged. He spoke out in a staff meeting, calling the incident an abuse of power hiding behind policy. Others stayed silent, worried about job security. A few defended Ms. Carver, claiming she was simply doing her job. But for Kamira and her father, the fallout wasn't about politics. It was personal. The home that had once echoed with the sounds of pencil scribbles, sketchbooks flipping, and bedtime jokes was now quiet. James sat at the kitchen table late into the night, rereading the medical exemption form they'd filed months ago. He wondered how something so clearly documented could be ignored so completely. The cover-up had begun. But so had the resistance. Captain Kamira Hayes had faced landmines in Kandahar, negotiated ceasefires in war zones, and held command over troops in some of the most volatile regions on Earth. But nothing prepared her for the image that flickered across her encrypted tablet screen inside a military base thousands of miles away. Her daughter, Kamira, being marched down a school hallway, tears streaking her face, her scalp exposed. The text from her husband was short and jagged. They shaved her head. "Without consent. She won't speak. We need you." Within the hour, Lena had requested emergency leave. Her commanding officer, upon seeing the footage, offered no resistance. 22 hours later, she landed in North Carolina, still wearing her combat boots. No suitcase. No sleep, just a firestorm of purpose. The next morning, Lena stood outside Winston Elementary's main office in full uniform. The building buzzed with the low hum of fluorescent lights and muffled conversations, but the moment she stepped inside, everything fell silent. The receptionist stuttered a greeting. A nearby teacher stopped mid-sentence. Eyes turned. Whispers followed. It wasn't just the uniform, it was the look in Lena's eyes, controlled fury, military calm masking maternal fire. She didn't wait to be escorted. She walked the halls with the same precision she used to inspect field formations. At 5'7", she wasn't the tallest person in the building, but her presence made ceilings feel lower. Her destination was clear, Principal Cheryl Whitman's office. "Do you have an appointment?" the secretary asked, halfway rising from her seat. "No," Lena said. "She does now." Whitman's face paled when Lena entered. Her practiced smile wavered. "Captain Hayes, I understand emotions are running high." "Not emotions," Lena said. "Facts. My daughter was assaulted on school property. Her rights were ignored. Your teacher bypassed medical documentation, parental contact, and basic human decency." Whitman shifted in her chair. "It was an unfortunate misunderstanding. Ms. Carver has been addressed." "A one-day suspension," Lena cut in. You called that addressed? She dropped a thick manila folder on the principal's desk. Inside were copies of Kamira's exemption forms, timestamps of emails, text messages between staff, screenshotted from a sympathetic teacher's leak, and legal briefings prepared during Lena's flight home. Everything documented, labeled, ordered, just like any field operation. "We have laws," Lena said, voice low and deliberate. "Federal laws. My daughter's medical condition falls under the Rehabilitation Act, Section 504, and the Americans with Disabilities Act. You ignored that, and now you're facing consequences." Whitman opened her mouth, but Lena wasn't finished. "This isn't about a dress code, it's about a pattern. I've seen the stories. Students across this country, black girls especially, are being punished for their appearance under the guise of vague language like professional and neat. Hair policing is discrimination, and your staff, your leadership, used it to violate my child." Whitman folded her hands but said nothing. Lena leaned forward. "This is your moment to decide which side of history you want to be on. The cover-up ends now, or it burns with you." She turned to leave, but stopped at the door. "Kamira won't walk these halls again until she feels safe, until justice starts here. And trust me, I didn't come back just to file paperwork. I came back to finish what your system started." Outside the office, word of Lena's visit spread fast. Students whispered. Teachers glanced over their shoulders. For many, it wasn't just the uniform. It was what she represented. A reckoning. Online, the momentum grew. The video of Kamira's humiliation now had over 1.2 million views. Influencers began stitching reaction clips. Celebrities reposted it with captions like, "This is why we need the Crown Act." News outlets requested interviews. Activists began organizing rallies, and Lena, she wasn't done. Her next stop wasn't the school board, it was the courthouse. By the third day, the clip of Kamira's silent walk down the school hallway, her braids gone, her eyes hollow, had crossed 2 million views. What began as a local incident was now national conversation. Comment sections overflowed with outrage, solidarity, and stories that mirrored her own. One mother posted, "My daughter was sent home for wearing locks last fall. They said it wasn't neat enough. I wish I'd recorded it." A high school senior wrote, "I used to wear head wraps for my alopecia. My teacher said it looked like I was making a statement." Kamira had unknowingly opened a door that thousands were ready to walk through. The pattern wasn't new, it had just been ignored. Now it was undeniable. Captain Lena Hayes understood that power wasn't just in the courtroom. It lived in collective memory, so she leaned into the moment, coordinating with advocacy groups and civil rights lawyers. She wasn't chasing revenge. She was building a strategy. Her military experience made her fluent in both pressure and precision. She drafted timelines, logged every document, tracked witness accounts. This wasn't emotional, this was tactical. The first lawsuit was filed 6 days after the incident. It named the school, Principal Whitman, and Ms. Carver as defendants. The legal team included specialists in educational equity and disability rights. Their claim outlined how Kamira's federal protections under Section 504 and the ADA had been violated intentionally and publicly, but it didn't stop there. Through anonymous tips and whistleblowers, Lena began to uncover something deeper. A former teaching assistant came forward, sharing a series of internal emails where staff debated whether braided hairstyles set a bad example. A counselor produced a log of complaints made by students of color, many of which had never been followed up on. One folder showed a note from Kamira's previous teacher warning about her sensitivity related to alopecia. It had been flagged non-urgent and buried. The weight of systemic failure was falling into place like puzzle pieces. Meanwhile, the #1 braids not violations hashtag became more than a trend. It became a rallying cry. Protesters showed up outside the district office, holding signs that read, "Our hair, our right, and protect our girls." Influencers shared videos explaining the cultural significance of protective hairstyles. Others highlighted the connection to laws like the Crown Act, which aimed to prohibit race-based hair discrimination in schools and workplaces. 24 states had passed Crown legislation, but North Carolina wasn't yet one of them. Lena used the moment to speak directly to lawmakers. She reached out to state representatives, offered to testify, and worked with policy analysts to draft a bill modeled after the Crown framework, adding in language to include medical exemptions like alopecia. She didn't just want accountability for Kamira, she wanted legislative change. Back home, Kamira remained mostly quiet, but she started drawing again. At first, only in black pencil. The images were raw: a girl in a hoodie with no face, a hallway with no windows, a figure standing over a chair holding electric clippers. Her silence spoke volumes. Then one morning she left a sketch on the kitchen table. It showed the same hallway, but this time the figure in the chair was standing up. A braid regrew like a vine from her scalp, rising into the sky. Lena stared at it, tears threatening her composure. She didn't say a word. She just placed it inside the manila folder with all the other evidence, proof that healing had begun. By week 2, more former students began stepping forward. Some were from Winston Elementary, others were from neighboring schools. One parent produced screenshots of her son's suspension over distracting curls. Another showed a complaint she'd filed after her daughter was told her afro was too political. The documents kept coming. Local news stations picked up the momentum, then national ones. Talk shows began discussing the case. A civil rights podcast dedicated an entire episode to the movement. The outrage was spreading, but so was the education. People were learning why these policies hurt students, why identity should never be treated as disruption. A grassroots campaign emerged, the Kamira Initiative. It called for every school district in the state to audit their dress code language, enforce clearer medical accommodation protocols, and mandate cultural sensitivity training for educators. The movement garnered endorsements from parent-teacher associations, veterans groups, and health organizations. The message was simple: dignity should never be up for debate. The district's attempt to suppress the incident had backfired. The more they resisted, the louder the conversation became. Kamira's story had evolved from a singular injustice into a shared awakening. Lena knew the legal fight would be long, but the cultural fight, that had already begun, and the momentum was theirs. The courtroom was quiet, but the tension was unmistakable, thick, humming beneath the fluorescent lights like a storm about to break. At the plaintiff's table sat Captain Lena Hayes, upright in civilian clothes but unmistakably military in presence. Beside her, her husband James reviewed notes, while Kamira, now 13, sat between them in a soft blue head wrap and a calm expression that belied the storm she had weathered. Across the aisle, Ms. Helen Carver wore a navy blazer, 2 sizes too large, and a practiced expression of restraint. She didn't meet Kamira's eyes. Next to her sat her attorney, Martin Rhodes, known in the region for defending school districts and diffusing PR disasters. Principal Cheryl Whitman sat 2 chairs down, eyes fixed straight ahead, her lips drawn into a tight line. She looked less like an educator and more like a bureaucrat caught in the spotlight. The judge, Marion Fletcher, a woman in her early 60s with a reputation for fairness and a no-nonsense courtroom, gavelled the session to order. Her courtroom had heard discrimination cases before, but none with this much public scrutiny. The first days were spent establishing the timeline: when Kamira's mother had filed the medical exemption, how the teacher and administration responded or failed to, and how the event unfolded. But what made this trial different wasn't just the evidence, it was the lens. The legal team didn't argue just about violation of school policy or due process. They framed the event through three intersecting lenses: racial bias, medical discrimination, and abuse of authority. The prosecution's lead attorney, Monique Ellis, opened with a quiet but forceful statement. This case is about power, who gets to use it and who pays the price when it's misused. Kamira Hayes didn't break a rule. She lived in a body and wore hair that didn't fit the comfort zone of her school's gatekeepers. And for that, she was humiliated, silenced, and stripped of her dignity. Testimony from the school nurse made the gallery shift in their seats. "I didn't want to do it," she said, her voice trembling. But Ms. Carver insisted she had clearance. She said we had to make an example. I should have stopped her. I didn't. Then came the IT specialist, a soft-spoken man named David Cho, who revealed that the school's internal video system had recorded the incident. The footage, nearly deleted by order of administration, had been backed up to a private drive. What the court saw, silent but searing, was Kamira being placed in the nurse's chair, her voice clearly pleading, her hands trembling as the clippers buzzed on. The clip was under a minute, but it landed like thunder. The defense tried to shift focus. "My client was enforcing school policy as written," Rhodes said. She was not aware of the student's medical condition because that information was not properly communicated to her. This is a case of tragic miscommunication, not malice. But Monique Ellis had anticipated that angle. She brought forward email threads, internal memos, and a damning note. A group chat message from Ms. Carver to another teacher, sent 30 minutes before the incident, that read, "I'm done coddling this one. Time to bring her back to reality." Ms. Carver was called to the stand. Under questioning, she maintained that she'd followed protocol, but when asked whether she verified Kamira's medical exemption personally, she faltered. "I assumed if it were that important, someone would have brought it to my attention." "You mean someone besides the student?" Ellis asked. "Yes, I mean someone in authority." "That's interesting," Ellis replied, "because Kamira Hayes told you directly, and you dismissed her because she wasn't wearing a badge." There was a long pause. "She was just a child," Ms. Carver finally said, voice low. "And you were just a teacher," Ellis replied, "one whose job it was to protect her." The courtroom fell into a silence that felt like held breath. The public response to the trial was explosive. News segments analyzed every development. TikTok creators reenacted courtroom moments. Hashtags like #Justice for Kamira and #Dignity in Schools trended daily. Protesters outside the courthouse held signs quoting Kamira's drawings, "I am not your lesson." Local artists displayed mural portraits of Kamira around the city. One piece, painted on a brick wall near downtown, showed her in silhouette with vines growing from her scalp, braids reimagined as symbols of resistance. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Kamira herself took the stand. The judge had granted special accommodations. She could speak with a support counselor by her side and would not be cross-examined directly by Ms. Carver's attorney. She wore her head wrap with quiet pride. Her voice was soft but clear. "When they cut my hair, I felt like I disappeared," she said. "It wasn't about rules. It was about how they saw me, like I didn't belong in my own body." She paused, her hands folded in her lap. "But I do belong, and I won't disappear again." Her words, amplified across screens and social platforms, reverberated beyond the courtroom. Editorials called her a symbol of resilience. Parent groups used her speech to train volunteers in educational equity advocacy. Her drawing, the one with the hallway and the braid like a vine, was printed on thousands of T-shirts and worn at school board meetings across the country. The jury deliberated for 5 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous. The school district, The principal and Ms. Carver were all found liable for negligence, emotional distress, and violation of civil rights. The damages awarded totaled $9.5 million, but the number didn't matter as much as the impact. Justice had spoken, but more importantly, so had Kamira. The verdict didn't just echo through the courtroom, it detonated through the school system. Within 72 hours of the ruling, Principal Cheryl Whitman resigned. Her statement, brief and non-apologetic, cited a desire to focus on personal wellness. But the district's internal emails told a different story. She'd been pressured by senior officials, worried about further exposure. In the weeks leading up to the trial, other complaints had emerged from parents and former staff. Some were old, some were recent. All pointed to a consistent thread. Black and brown students punished more harshly, disproportionately flagged for appearance violations, and repeatedly dismissed when they spoke up. The school board, once silent, was now fractured. 3 of its longest-standing members announced they wouldn't seek re-election. Public trust had eroded. Protests outside board meetings had grown louder, and community members demanded accountability beyond one teacher and one school. Ms. Carver's teaching license was suspended pending an ethics investigation. But by then, she had become a symbol of something larger. What happens when unchecked power is mistaken for discipline? Her defenders had grown quiet. Even former colleagues, once hesitant to speak, now called for mandatory bias training and sweeping review of disciplinary procedures. For Winston Elementary, the consequences were immediate. Parents pulled nearly 150 students in the month following the verdict. Local charter schools reported wait lists spiking. Teachers, especially younger ones, requested transfers. Staff turnover doubled. The school's budget, already strained, took a blow from both legal fees and declining enrollment. It wasn't just a lawsuit, it was a collapse of confidence. But where the old structure cracked, something new began to grow. Within a month of the trial's conclusion, the state legislature introduced a bipartisan bill dubbed the Hayes Act. Modeled loosely after the Crown Act, it expanded protections to include students with medical conditions that affect physical appearance. It required all schools to provide clear policies for medical accommodations, prohibit enforcement of dress code rules that disproportionately target racial identity, and establish independent oversight for disciplinary complaints. Crucially, it also mandated training for educators on cultural awareness and trauma-informed response protocols. The bill passed in a rare show of unity. Parents across the political spectrum agreed. No child should face public humiliation over how they look or the condition of their health. The law was signed less than 90 days after the jury reached their decision. Meanwhile, Kamira's story sparked policy reviews far beyond North Carolina. School districts in Texas, Illinois, and Florida began re-examining their appearance codes. Advocacy groups published toolkits for parents to challenge discriminatory policies. Civil rights organizations used Kamira's case as a legal precedent, citing it in cases involving religious head coverings, cultural dress, and disability-based harassment. At Winston Elementary, a new principal was named, Denise Boone, a former counselor known for restorative practices and inclusive leadership. Her first move wasn't administrative, it was symbolic. She removed the poster that had long hung near the front office, a list of behavior expectations that included phrases like quiet appearance and neutral dress. In its place, she posted student artwork submitted anonymously. In the center hung a scanned print of Kamira's hallway drawing, reprinted in full color. Boone also launched a task force made up of students, parents, and teachers to co-create a new appearance and behavior policy. "We're not here to erase what happened," she told the school at her first assembly. "We're here to make sure it doesn't happen again." The district followed suit, hiring outside consultants to audit years of suspension data, flag patterns of bias, and recommend changes. They added a new parent liaison role to every school. Hotline systems were expanded. Most importantly, they introduced a rule. Every disciplinary action involving appearance required a second-level review by a school nurse or counselor. No more single-point decisions. The shift was slow. Trust didn't rebuild overnight, but students noticed. So did parents. Kamira returned to school that fall, not to Winston, but to a magnet school across town with an arts-integrated curriculum. She kept her head wraps, sometimes wore her head uncovered. No one said a word. The system that tried to silence her was unraveling, and in its place, something fairer was starting to rise. Kamira Hayes didn't ask to become a symbol. She never intended to ignite national policy discussions or inspire legislation. But what happened to her, what was taken from her, resonated with people far beyond the walls of Winston Elementary. The pain had been public. So, too, would be the healing. By spring, Kamira's art had moved from her sketchpad to gallery walls. Her first exhibit, hosted by a downtown community center, was titled Uncovered. The centerpiece was a vivid canvas showing a bald girl walking across a cracked school hallway. Her feet glowed like coals. Behind her, a trail of roots and braids grew from the ground, rising into trees. Above the doorway she walked through, the words, "They tried to erase me. I redrew myself." The exhibit wasn't just catharsis. It became the foundation for something larger. With support from donors, teachers, and civil rights advocates, the Kamira Project was launched. A non-profit initiative, it provided art therapy to students recovering from trauma, especially those facing discrimination or bullying related to identity, health, or appearance. The project began with weekend workshops but quickly expanded to school-based residencies, parent advocacy sessions, and counselor training modules. In its first year, the Kamira Project worked with over 600 students across 5 states. Partnerships with pediatric psychologists and public schools allowed the program to scale rapidly. For many children, especially young Black girls, it became a safe space where appearance was not policed, but celebrated, where self-expression was not punished, but nurtured. Meanwhile, Kamira found a new rhythm. Her new school embraced her quiet confidence, her evolving voice. No one asked about her hair. No one whispered in hallways. She wore vibrant wraps some days and left her head bare others. The choice, finally, was hers. Her story also reshaped conversations at the national level. In Washington, the passage of the Hayes Act prompted discussions about expanding the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act idea to include clearer language around non-visible conditions like alopecia. Civil rights groups lobbied for broader Crown Act adoption, pointing to the viral awareness created by Kamira's story. Within months, 3 additional states passed legislation banning hair-based discrimination in schools. What had begun as a viral video had become legislative leverage. Media outlets tracked the transformation. From trial updates to policy shifts, the story was covered in podcasts, documentaries, and student-led journalism pieces. One segment, produced by a teenage reporter in Atlanta, ended with the line, "We always hear about movements that start from marches. But this one started in a nurse's chair." That line stuck. By the following year, schools around the country were using Kamira's story in their equity and inclusion training. Her video testimony from the trial, once searing with pain, became a resource for change. Teachers watched. Parents reflected. Students wrote essays on what justice looked like to them. But Kamira remained grounded. She still painted in the sunroom of her house, still spent weekends with Maya, her best friend, watching anime and laughing until their stomachs hurt. Still got nervous before tests and still sometimes had days when the world felt too loud. That was part of the healing too, remembering she was still just a girl. At the dedication of the new community mural painted on the side of the district's central office, a piece titled "Still I Rise," Kamira was asked to speak. She stepped up to the mic, wearing a blue head wrap with gold embroidery, her voice steady but soft. "I didn't want to be brave," she said. "I wanted to be left alone, but since I wasn't, I'm glad I could be loud without yelling. We all deserve to be seen even when we're quiet, especially then." As the crowd applauded, cameras flashing and murals gleaming behind her, Kamira smiled, not because the fight was over, but because it was just beginning, and this time the world was finally listening. Kamira Hayes never returned to the building where her trauma began, but she didn't need to. Her legacy wasn't bound to those hallways. It stretched far beyond, into policy, into classrooms, into living rooms where families watched her story unfold and whispered, "This could have been us." In the end, justice wasn't a single moment. It wasn't the verdict or the legislation or even the apology letters sent months later. Justice was the quiet rebuilding of dignity. It was Kamira standing tall in front of strangers, turning pain into purpose. It was students learning they had the right to be seen as whole. It was teachers rethinking what enforcement really means and who it harms. Justice was not about perfection. It was about presence, about refusing to let silence stand in for accountability. The systems that once protected harm had begun to shift. Policies changed. Power was questioned. Most importantly, children across the country saw what could happen when someone stood up, not with a fist, but with the truth. Kamira didn't ask for a movement. She asked to be left alone. But when the world wouldn't give her that, she made something else. A mirror. One that forced institutions to see themselves clearly and forced us all to ask what we do when that reflection is ugly. The final image in her sketchbook was simple. A young girl with closed eyes, head bare, standing beneath a wide tree. The trunk was woven from braids, the branches stretching far enough to shade others. Beneath it, a caption in her handwriting, "This isn't the end of the story. It's just the part where we change the ending." And with that, Kamira Hayes, age 13, redrew what justice could look like, and the world finally traced her lines.